All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kaylin Rosenberg, and I am the Program Manager for the Carolinas Collaborative on Climate, Health, and Equity. Before we dive into today's webinar, let's review a few quick logistics. So today's webinar is being recorded, and this recording will be made available on our website after the event. So please stay muted to avoid any unnecessary background noise. Having your video on is completely optional, and you are welcome to type questions and comments in the chat. We will have a dedicated time for the panelists to respond to questions towards the end of the webinar today. So today's webinar will explore the role of students in research. And this is the second webinar in our multi-part series focused on community-engaged research. To get started today, I'll tell you a little more about the Carolinas Collaborative on Climate, Health, and Equity, and then I will hand it over to my co-host, Emily, who will introduce the Global One Health Academy. So let's get started. Sorry, everyone, I'm juggling multiple things on my screen. Here we go. So the Carolinas Collaborative on Climate, Health, and Equity is also called the C3HE program, and we are a National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Climate Adaptation Partnership, also called a NOAA CAP program. We are housed at North Carolina State University, and we are a multi-institution team composed of physical and social scientists, community leaders, researchers, outreach professionals, and students. Our work centers on building community partnerships to advance climate resilience and health equity. We work together with communities across the Carolinas to help address their exposure to climate threats such as fire, flood, and heat. Moreover, our team's focus is on understanding our changing climate and mitigating the impacts in a just and equitable way. We integrate science and regional knowledge to co-produce solutions that are tailored to meet unique local needs. We also focus our efforts on frontline and at-risk populations and thereby strive to support communities that are disproportionately exposed to climate hazards and other compounding social inequities. To share some of the work we have been doing, we are co-hosting this spring webinar series, and we're really glad you all could join us today. So now I will turn things over to my co-host, Emily, to introduce the Global One Health Academy and today's topic. Take it away, Emily.
Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. Okay. So hi, everyone. I will start by introducing the Global One Health Academy, and I'm part of this program. So the goal of the Global One Health Academy is to engage faculty, staff, undergraduate, and graduate students in improving the health of plants, animals, biodiversity, and human society in North Carolina and beyond. So these are some example research activities of the Academy: research enablement, fellows program, travel grants, professional development workshops, and courses. And so here we have a QR code and a link so you can go to the Global One Health Academy website and learn more about their programs. So since this webinar is focused on community engaged research, I just wanted to give a little bit background on myself and how I got involved in community engaged research. Yes, so I guess in high school I volunteered with a Habitat for Humanity program and really loved this. So this got me interested in like more local engagement. Next, please. And then undergraduate, my university had a action research project course where we worked in East St. Louis, Illinois, and then also in the local community, working with people experiencing homelessness. And I was very active in alternative spring break, also working with homelessness and disability rights as a volunteer. And I think I wanted to give these two examples because you can do community engagement and research, but you can also get started just with courses or even reaching out to local volunteer organizations. Next, please. And then after my undergraduate, I had the opportunity to do Peace Corps and do nonprofit work. And next, please. And then finally, in graduate school, a lot of my research has been focused with international partners. And I should have also said local partners because recently we were working, me and my advisor, Dr. Grishop, were working in a project in Cary, which is right here in North Carolina. Next, please. So my involvement in the Global One Health Academy is I'm a fellow this past year. And so I just wanted to give a quick overview of my research. So my research focused on environmental health trade-offs. And this photo shows a kitchen in Nepal. And so in our research group, we're very concerned about energy use. Next, please. So we often look at, is there fuel or energy available? So do people have enough wood, or do people have electricity access? Next, please. And so one of the concerns also we are looking at is, do people have water? Is the water safe to drink? And so the first research question we look at are, what are the health impacts of boiling drinking water with solid fuels? Next, please. And then we also look at the health and climate impacts of smoke from burning wood or from other fuels. And so the second research question are, what are the health and climate impacts of cooking with liquefied petroleum gas? Next, please. And then also we're concerned about food insecurity. So is there enough food to eat? Is the food heated and safe to eat? And so the final research question are, what are the impacts of energy insecurity on food storage and reheating practices? Next, please. And so to answer all these questions, we must engage with community partners. So now I'm going to have each of our panelists, we're going to introduce each of the panelists. The way this works, we'll go through everyone one by one. And if you can please give your name, title, affiliation, and a 30-second elevator pitch about your research. And then during the panel discussion, you'll have the opportunity to share more about what you do. So we'll start with Dr. Grisha.
All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Andy Grishop. I'm a professor in the Department of Civil Construction and Environmental Engineering at NC State. And I'm also the faculty advisor for Engineers Without Borders at the university. And my research area is broadly air pollution. And I come from a background studying atmospheric aerosols. But I'm very interested in links between air pollution emissions and climate change, personal exposure to air pollution, transformation of air pollution, and then links between energy systems and air pollution and climate. And so a lot of my work in recent years has been on the issue kind of that Emily highlighted of household energy in low income settings. And so we've done a lot of work looking at alternative fuels or technologies to try to reduce some of these impacts. And that has involved a lot of work with NGOs and with communities. And most of it's international. I haven't done a huge amount of sort of community engaged local work, but I'm interested in expanding in that area. So thanks for inviting me, and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Grisha. Next, Dr. Clinton.
Good morning. I am Dr. Clinton. I am a new assistant professor here at NC State in the Department of Biological Sciences. My work spans many different disciplines. Essentially, I look at historical burial grounds, those of early African Americans or enslaved Africans, and try to connect them to local living descendants. We're performing this work here in North Carolina at several different sites, in South Carolina, Texas, Pennsylvania, all over. The work that we do is non-destructive, so we use the burial soil instead of the human remains, so that we can leave our loved ones at rest and not, have them in a collection somewhere. We do a genetic analysis to connect those two communities, the historical and the contemporary, but we also look at aspects of health. So what does disease burden look like 400 years ago? What does that look like today, and how is it changing over time? Also illuminating aspects of the lifestyles of these individuals and their contribution.
Thank you, Dr. Clinton. Next, Dr. Hebron, if you can introduce yourself.
Greetings, everybody. I'm Jeffrey Hebron. I'm a professor of sustainability science here at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. I focus on equitable climate resilience, teaching courses in resilience and adaptation and sustainability and social justice. And shout out to all the fellow Peace Corps volunteers out there. I am one of those. And I try to do community engaged work, be interested in talking with Dr. Clinton about burial work, some of the work that we've done in Bucksport, South Carolina. So yeah, that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hebron. And finally, Dr. Rivers, if you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. My name is Louis. I used to be faculty at NC State. I'm adjunct faculty at NC State in the School of Forestry and Environmental Resources. Right now, I am at the Environmental Protection Agency in the Office of Research and Development, where I help coordinate social science into our research portfolio. And ORD, I'll try not to speak in acronyms, which is hard when you're in the government, does the basic and applied research that supports the EPA's mission and a lot of our state environmental regulatory agencies. And my research all involves working with communities. I study the risk perception and decision making in minority and frontline communities around environmental issues, and also in terms of criminal justice issues. So there's often this work does involve interactions directly with affected communities. So I'm looking forward to the panel today.
Thank you, Dr. Rivers. So now we'll move into the panel discussion. So the way this works is we have a few questions we will go through, and then after that, we will open it up to the audience. So next slide, please. And so for the first one, we could, whoever would like to start, you're welcome. And also, I guess for each question, we would love to hear from everyone, but it's also not a requirement to respond to every question, if that makes sense. So the first question is, what is community engaged research? Why is it important? And what are the benefits of this type of research over other approaches that do not engage with communities? So if you'd like to start, you can unmute.
I guess I'll start then. So I view community engaged research as changing the focus of research, trying to put communities at the center of research. And certainly, I guess this is coming mainly from academia. In terms of, I was brought up looking at social science, and you take community sociology or community fill in the blank, and you study about things, you read about others. And then you might go out and collect data. And so there's a whole continuum of community engaged research in terms of whether it's I'm the outsider going to the inside and trying to understand the community versus trying to address a research problem that's rooted in the community. In other words, perhaps the community has already identified that as a research question. And then there's, of course, involving the community in collecting the data themselves or in partnership. So it's going from looking at others from the outside in to a continuum of doing the research on the inside out. And so I know you brought up action research, and people talk about participatory research. And so there's a huge continuum in terms of what that is. And I think the benefit is ensuring that doing research that's practical and applied and meaningful to the communities. And that might range as far as also in terms of the validity of the research that you're doing. So I can go to the census and pull up data and talk about a community and say, hey, guess what? You have so many people in poverty or so-and-so, and I can run it into a statistical model and it will spit out some results. But until you're there in the community, talking to them, seeing them, hearing their response to it, that adds validity in terms of what that looks like. And sort of getting that community voice. And then the other one is representation and power. I see this as well. So when communities are able to collect their own data or having data collected in partnership to be able to represent them in a way that they feel is meaningful and hopefully accomplishes their goals.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in. I think that was a great answer, and I want to echo, many of those points. I'll start at the title or the term community engaged. I like to think of the research that I do as community led, where the community is really the party that is expressing what the problem is, and we're building scientific objectives, testable hypotheses around those concerns. And that way, we really need to, as researchers, start thinking about the fact that communities have more to offer than just being the subject of the study, but they contribute to the research, how it's done, even the dissemination of data. And I think in that way, we see increased engagement, which really is what we need in research, particularly for the demographic that I work with. So people who are African American or African descended, for things like clinical trials, right? That we struggle to get participants from this demographic because of this long, historical mistrust. But it also allows for autonomy, for them to feel like they are creating part of the research. With these things combined, I think it significantly impacts the level of empowerment that is felt by the community, right? And not just going out to the community, but having them come into the lab. Recognizing that they may not have gone to college, but they're able to have access to the research, see how these things are being done, especially when they're with their own ancestors.
Thank you. Dr. Rivers or Dr. Grishop, if you'd like to contribute, you're welcome. But like I said, not necessary for every question.
I was just going to say, from an engineering standpoint, engineers want to fix problems, but I think often, are led by maybe external perception of what a problem is or what a viable solution may be. And so, I think in engineering and in science, there can be this kind of top-down, I'm the expert viewpoint, and I think really community engaged research should flip that, right? Because the people who understand the problem are the people that are living or the situation, or the people that are living that sort of reality. So I think, to me, that's the sort of maybe an ideal that really should be coming from the bottom up. And obviously there needs to be a meeting because there's expertise and equipment and resources and all that kind of thing that can be brought from an academic setting. But so I think that's what the ideal is, and I think the benefit obviously is what my colleagues have said much better than I could, but that there's this relevance of, again, I think as an engineer in terms of problems and solutions, but also, just building knowledge, the knowledge that's built, or the solutions that get hopefully co-developed actually are relevant and will work, rather than being something that kind of parachutes in and maybe is ineffective.
Thank you. I don't know, Dr. Rivers, would you like to add?
I think my colleagues have done a good job of covering this, this idea of community engaged research. I appreciate what everyone said, especially Dr. Grishop around. I find like communities do want problems solved. So like sometimes as scientists, we don't have, our research may be more esoteric in nature, or maybe this idea of knowledge building or creating capacity, but I think often communities have distinct problems that they want solved. And if our research doesn't directly speak to those problems, I can understand why communities may not want to engage with us. So I think this idea of problem solving is really important, and especially coming from a federal perspective. At the EPA, all of our research is really aimed at answering distinct questions that are pressing for communities.
Thank you, everyone. Very great answers to the question. So we'll go on to the next slide and question. How do you build partnerships to start a community engaged research project? And at what stage of the research process do students become involved? And whoever would like to start, you're welcome to start.
I think it's like we talked about the continuum. And so I think it's a both and. And so I've been involved, I guess, probably more in the, I guess, across the continuum. Some of those are top down. Someone recognizes that there's a problem. And so going into the community already with a research question, because it's been stated as a problem. For example, I was involved in Michigan on a fish consumption advisory project, and it was something that we identified on the outside as, there are fish consumption advisories. People aren't as aware as they should be. And so going into communities and people saying, what, there's a problem? Like, why are you here? And so they didn't ask for anybody to come in and ask them about fish consumption or mercury or whatever, because they looked around and for them, everything was great. This is pristine because you can't see mercury pollution. So there, it's like once there's a problem and then trying to find who's the person in the communities, whether it's an extension program or a nonprofit or a church group or somebody that's already rooted in the community that has those connections is really important because I'm not from that community, and they don't even necessarily see something as a problem, but there potentially is from a health perspective. And so it's trying to recognize I need to learn about this community. And so who is it that enables me to do that? So that's one end. And then the other end is, hey, Dr. Hebron, I hear you do these things. Could you come to our community and help us out? And so there's that. So the community is coming. And then I guess the in between is, or sort of is like, I'm from the community. So I live here or engage in that. And so there's sort of a blend between, I know I'm sort of a top-down-y person because I'm the academic, but on the other hand, I don't need to ask anybody because I live here. So those are different ways. But I think regardless is trying to connect with people who have a connection to a community, whatever that community means, and then trying to figure out, again, is it driven by somebody else? Who are the actors involved? Is there a lead actor or are there multiple stakeholders involved in that process? And I really, most of the time, try to let the other partner drive that because in most of the cases, I'm not from that community. And so I really have to listen and try to understand who's involved and so forth.
Thank you. Would someone else like to add more? The very great answer.
I can add in a little bit about the idea of when students should become involved with the project, which I think has evolved during the course of my career. I think when I was an assistant professor, I was hesitant to involve students because students turn over and students have busy lives, and when you're engaged with a community, I think you want to put your best foot forward. I'm not saying students are your best foot forward, but students have a lot of pulls on their time. And I think there's also a certain maturity that comes from just growing older and realizing how you interact with people, especially so most of my work has been with Black communities. And like, there's a level of respect that you need to have when you engage with elders in the Black community. You can't call people by their first names. And, it's nothing personal, but that's something. So initially I was kind of hesitant, but as I've gotten older, and just I think as students and the needs of students have changed, I think it may be important, especially to engage students sooner than later, especially in local projects. I'll do a hyper local example. If I'm doing work within Raleigh, North Carolina, and we have students, I'm doing work in some of the Black neighborhoods in Raleigh, North Carolina. Some of the NC State students don't even know these neighborhoods exist. So I think it's important that our students develop a better idea of their very local community. I think a lot of times our students are thinking about, when they think about it, community engaged work, it is in an international context, because in some ways that's easier. And it's less of a cognitive dissonance having to deal with the issues right in your backyard that you don't have to think about every day. So increasingly, I think it's important to engage students as early as possible in projects. And, a student doesn't have to be in the lead, but I think it's important that students are in the room, even just so they can learn about these communities and like learn the norms of different communities. And I think it's another type of education that we don't do as good a job in the university, of really connecting our students with local communities. And I think researchers who do local community engaged research can help with that education, which I think is super important. Sorry for that kind of rambling answer.
Oh, no, I think that was a that was a very great answer, and I agree. Yes, thank you, Dr. Cliff.
Yeah. So I'll jump in. I like to build partnerships or initiate community engaged research or community led research simply with a conversation. So a lot of the work that I do now really comes from the descendant communities where they reach out to me. Either they've seen, they've seen the publication or heard about the research or seen, the National Geographic video. And again, they come with their concerns or a problem that they have, but just starting the conversation allows for me to get to know the community as a community, and it allows for them to get to know me as a researcher, but also develop the relationship of being a trusted agent in the field. Because as I mentioned, previously, for all of the things that have happened, people sometimes shy away from science. And, that's just my firsthand experience. Going to talk to people, taking an interest in their interests, validating different viewpoints. Everybody is not going to have the same wishes and desires in the community, learning from their knowledge, right? Asking them to teach me because oral histories are valid. Storytelling, that mode of passing out information is valid. And honestly, it adds the historical context to the things that we find using our molecular technology. The second part of the question, when do we involve students? Right off the bat, I usually like to involve students from the initiation of the project and even getting their input into how we should design the research. So all of my students that come into the lab and do this type of research have to take a cultural competency training, just given the sensitivity of the research that we conduct in the lab. Students, I find, bring a unique perspective to the research. Either coming from their own cultural backgrounds, or having done the training and the background work before we even go out into the field. They, as students, they also have to learn that community engagement is it's necessary. It's not a bonus. It is something that enriches the research, but is absolutely necessary if you're working with a descendant community. It's not just, oh, can I just, get the saliva sample? Can I just get the data so I can get through my project? You have to build relationships.
Thank you. Very good answer. Thanks.
I was gonna, a couple things that Dr. Rivers mentioned really resonated. One, I've mainly done international work, and in some ways, it is easier. Because of that distance, right? But and I don't honestly know if I say what I have done is really fully community engaged research. What I've typically worked is via nonprofits who are sort of embedded in working in communities, and then I bring a certain expertise. So there's sort of a mediating kind of organization, right? And that helps, right? Because they have this investment, they have trust, and then they maybe trust that I kind of bring this sort of technical ability and, openness to work on these problems. But I think, a couple words that just keep coming up are trust, and also I would say time, right? Because trust doesn't happen right away. And that, from speaking from the international or international work perspective, is really challenging, right? Because to have that time to build the trust means, if I'm working in India or if I'm working in Malawi, they're really far away. It's really expensive to go there, to bring students there, to bring teams there. So building that relationship is very difficult. And the time frame that research grants say work on doesn't necessarily match with that, right? So that's a huge challenge. But so I think having these mediating organizations is really key, and I think it's absolutely critical internationally, but also I think for local work. And then as far as students' involvement, I agree that as soon as possible is really key. And I think with Emily, you and I, a lot of your work has been kind of in conversation, right? And so that last project that you talked about is really something that you've been working on with several other faculty. So I think that's part of the training, but I definitely echo what Dr. Rivers said and Dr. Clinton, that training and kind of mentorship to make sure that people are sensitive to various issues is really important.
Thank you. And Dr. Hebron? I see your hands up. Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to comment about the student preparation part. And so, I think it is great to sort of say as soon as possible. But at the same time, Dr. Clinton was talking about preparation. And so there's a tension there. And so I think it's really important to ideally, and then Dr. Grisham talked about the time as well, in terms of that I think preparation is key. And so I think ideally is, at least from Furman is a predominantly an undergraduate institution. And so what we've tried to do is, on paper anyway, talk about scaffolding. And so there are some frameworks for thinking about, primarily our students are going to be doing community engaged research perhaps as right after their junior year. That's sort of like the typical flow of things. But we don't know because education is nonlinear. But there are opportunities all along that way to where we can talk about the concepts, talk about what it means, talk about bias, talk about cultural competence, do smaller engagements with communities, community service, have so that by the time they get to, okay, now I'm going to be engaging with the community on research. And like you said, like I've got to work with somebody to collect a saliva sample or something like that. Or most of our students aren't African-American. So you've got that whole thing as well. Like, well-intended students, but like if you really don't know that culture, and Louis talked about that, calling people by first names or things like that, that I think it's important to sort of think about how are we going to scaffold it to make it a good experience for students and the community. And so I think that whole idea of scaffolding, ideally to me, is part of that preparation, not just, oh, I took an online course on cultural competence, which I have my students do. Here's my certification. That's something, but like ideally, I would like to be working with students who have not, this isn't the first time they're engaging with community when it comes time to doing research. They've already done something with somebody along those lines.
Dr. Rivers? And thank you, Dr. Hebron.
Yeah, and just to follow up on what the other panelists are saying, I think we would be remiss if we didn't, put this in the context of the current student protests that we see happen across the country. And I think the protest is incredibly important. But I think there's also something important to be learned when you're in dialogue and communion with communities. Communities are complex, they're heterogeneous, and it's a very different type of interaction that a student would have when they're in this type of project where they're partners with a community, as opposed to like a protest, where like that's a very different way of viewing a community and interacting with the community. There's still interactions with a community there, but it may be a distant community. It may be a community that you're not in constant dialogue with. It may be a community that you're in dialogue with certain representatives of that community. So I think I often worry that, and this is just as a young people, but it's just like Americans in general, we like to make things too black and white and too simple. And like communities are very complex. I know in one of my early projects, I was focusing on environmental justice in a largely Black community. And we had done a focus group. It was all Black women. They were over 50. And most of the women in the group were very excited to talk about this idea of environmental racism. But I had one particular panelist who stood out and she's like, I don't think environmental racism is a problem. And she started talking about other things. And like, it was an eye-opening moment for me as a young faculty member, because it made me realize that, like, A, you can't make assumptions about what people think. And then B, communities really are heterogeneous. We say this all the time, but there's a large amount of different perceptions and ideas within a community. And I think that's hard to get or understand as a student without that direct contact with the community in dialogue. And to get that, and to get to that heterogeneity, you have to talk to a lot of people. You have to interact with a lot of people. And I think that's incredibly important. And I'm not sure where else you can get that type of interaction with communities that you're not a part of besides the university process. Because after university, you kind of start your life and you don't have time for these type of exercises unless you're doing it for your job. So I just to emphasize what I said earlier, I think as I've progressed in my career, I really realized the importance of this community engaged research and like helping develop our students in university.
Oh, thank you. Really excellent thoughts. And I guess as you move on to the next question, you're always welcome to like also put additional thoughts in the chat. So next slide, please. So the next question is, what opportunities do your organizations or institutions offer for students to engage in research? And whoever would like to start.
Well, like I said, Furman is a predominantly undergraduate institution, and we forward the Furman Advantage. So that's my marketing for the call. And so the Furman Advantage focuses on making sure that students have an opportunity to do study away, undergraduate research, internships, all of those things. And the great opportunity here at Furman is there's a pool of funds for any student at any level to apply for to do summer research with a faculty member. Like I mentioned earlier, our students in our program, do thesis research, but you can also do research at any level. And students just have to connect to a faculty member. They can apply for funding. That funding would cover, a stipend during the summer to do research, but they can also do non-stipend research during the course of a year. But here at Furman, that's become really elevated over the last several years as being something that everybody does regardless of your major. Some programs like ours require either a community engaged project or thesis research, but now everybody, whether you're in studio art or philosophy or whatever. So I think the institution at Furman says, hey, we want to encourage students to go out in the world and do some research at some other level. And we also realize that that comes with financial constraints. And so Furman has vehicles to help students to get that as well.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to contribute to this question?
I mean, the College of Engineering at NC State has something called Engineer Your Experience, which is a way that students can access, engineering students, I think only engineering students can access funds for their own kind of projects or enterprises. So, if a student had a link with a community, for example, that they wanted to explore a project of, say, engineering relevance, that might be a resource. And then also there are, departments have research experience for undergraduate programs, and then there are REUs, that are open from universities across the country. I'd say the Global One Health Academy is also one to put in a plug, right? Another possible resource. But I think, I think there are lots of different research options. I think finding things that are, if you want to do community engaged, there is this question of sort of timing, and so I think finding faculty members or other researchers in the institution that are doing work in an area that is inspiring or is piques your curiosity. That's kind of the place to start. Yeah.
Thank you. Does anyone else have thoughts about this question?
The EPA has a position. So we have a position called student service contractors, and they're not actually students. It's a poorly titled thing. A lot of things are in the government, but it actually is a position that we hire for recent graduates. Currently, I have a student service contractor that works closely with me, who was a graduate of NC State, and I knew her as a student at NC State. So these are kind of like transitional positions where designed for people who just kind of finish up undergrad or their masters, and they're trying to figure out, they know they want to do something around science and they're not sure exactly what. So you kind of do this for 2 or 3 years, and often these students go on to do their masters or PhDs with this experience of helping out with the research process in the EPA. So if there's anyone in the audience who is graduating and looking for positions, these are, unfortunately, they're put on USA.jobs or through the Oak Ridge Laboratory website, where a lot of these positions are listed, and neither one of these systems are very user friendly. That's where these positions are listed at. So, but we're always looking for people who are kind of in that liminal space between degrees.
Thank you. Does anyone else have thoughts about this question? If not, we'll go to the next question, and then as we start the next question, I want to invite the audience to start putting some of your questions in the chat, because we'll soon switch over to audience questions. So the next question is, what are the skills that you've gained in working with community partners on co-produced research?
I think one of the skills, and this is from a faculty perspective, I didn't do this as a student. I mean, my PhD and master's were I did laboratory work. That's the opposite of community engaged work. I think one of the skills I developed is kind of be able to think about multiple projects at a time. So if you're going to do this work in a university setting, especially an R1 setting, you have to, there's long time spans for this work, so you can't rush it. You have to be patient. So like maybe not expect a publication every year to come out of this work. So like just to make that work for most faculty members, you also have to be able to balance these other projects that kind of like pay the bills during the day. You know, these projects that are more conventional and they may lead to more regular publications. So I think patience is something that I've learned in doing this work in communities, and also like really thinking about how to make sure that I am still, meeting the needs that the university lines out for me. Which, I know that sounds kind of mercenary, but like there is a give and take. We have these positions at the university, and the university loves community engaged work. But when you go for tenure, there's very clear metrics on what they want. And I often worry because I think some of our most talented faculty do this type of work, and it takes up so much of them, and then they don't get the type of recognition they need for doing this type of work. So just realizing that you need to be able to balance some of this more, I think, long-term rewarding work, but may not have the immediate tangible outcomes the university desires, kind of balancing those.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Dr. Clinton.
Yeah, I'll come in to follow that, because and this probably speaks to the last question, but I'm pretty new, so I don't really know the names of the mechanisms to offer those opportunities. But speaking to the point that was just made by Dr. Rivers, I've experienced, and I haven't been here that long, the opposite. And so coming in and making it clear, this is what's important to me. The research is important. I'm also, a lab trained individual, but the work that I do, everything that goes into a test tube came from a community. And so having to engage with the community, is paramount, to anything else. And it's so important that that was something that needed to be written into my offer letter. This is not service. This is not extra. This is as robust as whatever goes into the publication. So I kind of wanted to throw that out there. I think, even with the conversation, there are, ways to navigate that value of this type of work. To get to this question, sorry, the skills gained in working in community engaged research, and I'll also extend that to things that I've learned, because we have to learn things to move forward. It's that each community, the needs of each community is unique. There's no cookie cutter situation. It all depends on the conversation that comes out of the community, what they desire, what they're looking for, how we can facilitate it, if we can even facilitate it with the technology that we have, acknowledging that everyone has something to contribute. The community, the grad students, the elders of the community, the children of the community who bring these different perspectives. And kind of falling back on that part that I've learned is that showing humility is essential in this type of work, realizing that I don't know everything, right? Just because I'm formally trained in an institution doesn't mean that, I have all of the answers, but also when I enter these communities, recognizing my privilege, right? That I have that training, that I have that degree, that not everyone may have, or simply because I work with African American communities and I identify as an African American doesn't make me an expert on the topic, right? It is listening to those cultural similarities and differences, and how we can relate based on a shared experience or learn based on things that were not included in my own experience, right? That are maybe relevant to the location of the community, the timing of the problem, and really the possibility of the information to be generated from the project.
Thank you, Dr. Clinton. Does anyone else have thoughts on this question?
I think this kind of echoes what has been said, but I think, patience is really important. I think what Dr. Rivers said about the sort of time scale of working with communities versus what might be expected in academia. I also think, it's human endeavor, right? So you're working with people, and so I think showing up and listening, and I think what Dr. Clinton said about being humble is really key, because you have a certain expertise, but you really you're trying to work with a community, and so just spending time and listening is I think kind of, I think we're on a Zoom webinar, right? So this enables a certain kind of connection, but it really does not work. We're maybe used to it, and it's a poor replacement for, being in a room with someone. And that's even more the case when you're dealing with communities that don't, this isn't a normal medium, phone, Skype, any of that stuff. So I think just showing up, spending time, kind of being on the ground is critical.
Thank you.
And, and I guess one of the biggest things I've learned doing this work is like research isn't always the answer. I think especially being in the academy, we do prioritize research. I think research is important. But as I spend more time in communities, the, a lot of the issues that communities deal with cannot be addressed by a research project. And I think increasingly, research is almost serving as a stopgap for social infrastructure that's not performing the services that communities need. So I'm always kind of, you know, I'm always thinking about, I don't have the power to make these changes, but, I was like, could we make this into like an on the ground program? Could this be an intervention? Could we think about different ways of funding this funding instead towards research grants? And, I think that would be a change of mindset for how we govern. So much of the work we do is via grants. And like, I think another panelist said that these grant cycles don't really work for communities, this type of work. But I think I would like to see us go away. And maybe research isn't always the answer. Maybe sometimes the answer is just having someone full time in that community, helping them connect to resources. So I think that's a big mindset change I've had through years of working or listening to communities.
Thank you, Dr. Rivers. So in the interest of time, we're going to, so we have this final question, and then I'm going to jump to the audience question, and then feel free to contribute to either one. So the final prepared question is for students and early career professionals interested in getting involved in community engaged research. What advice can you offer? And then for the audience question, which you can also see in your chat, so it says such an important point about recognizing the heterogeneity of communities. Everyone who wants to make a difference in any community has to deal with differences of opinion and respectful conflict. Any tips for addressing or resolving those disagreements or conflicts? And I can also put that question in the chat because you have to scroll up. So let me put this here.
Well, I think they probably are linked together here. And so if you want to be involved in community engaged research, from an academic standpoint is understanding what community means. And so we can read a lot of papers on what is community and recognizing that it's heterogeneous. And so I think that's a really important thing to recognize, that like, what is community? And even if I engage with certain stakeholders or leaders, it's like they don't speak for everybody, and you're going to have diversity. And the whole idea of listening. And so multiple people have said that. I would say that's a skill that's really important. It gets kind of frustrating because students are also on a different timeline. From my experience, they want something to happen now because, I took this course, I'm having this experience. I was like, no, you just need to listen. All right, listen, and because the more you listen, then you might realize that, wait a minute, so-and-so said this, and that other group of people said this. And it's like, that's right. So if you just jump to conclusions after, listening to a couple people, you might come away thinking that it's just one, or we read about this and then I'm seeing something different. So I think listening and humility is important. And I think the other one that linked to the previous questions is mistakes will be made, and they will be made by me. And you just have to get past that. And I think that's important for communities to recognize as well, is that we're all fallible and we're all human beings learning in this process. But because of it, mistakes are going to be made. People are going to miss things, say things, and that is hard. And so that, to me, that's the humility part, is that, you make a mistake, you own up to that mistake, and you keep going, ask for forgiveness or whatever. But I think that's what I would say is the advice is like, you have to be willing to be in that space, and it's not going to be necessarily simple. Somebody said about kind of the black and white answer. And so, but get out there. And I go back to the whole scaffolding point, is get experience, whether it's a service project, a one-day thing, but don't go out thinking like you're the answer or that the community owes you anything, in terms of feeling good, which I see that as well sometimes with students, is but we went out and like we didn't accomplish anything. It's like, well, we're not here for you to feel good about accomplishing something. Like it's not about you, it's about the community. And if what we did was this point, then yeah, maybe you personally didn't get anything out of it. That and you didn't feel good because you didn't clean up a neighborhood and make it better all in whatever the time period is. Again, this is a longer term investment. And so if this is what you want to do, take some small nibbles into it and build yourself up to that.
Thank you. And so I just want to say we have a few more minutes for the conversation. So we can take one or two more comments and then we'll wrap up with a few announcements right before noon. So I don't know if anyone else has some final thoughts before we move into announcements.
I don't know if it's a final thought, but I just want to applaud Dr. Hebron. He's too modest to say it, but like he's not only been teaching students, but he teaches other faculty. And I don't know if Jeffrey, if you remember this, but we were both on faculty at Michigan State. This was over 18 years ago. It's a long time ago. I was a new faculty member, and Jeffrey took the time out to take me on a trip to Detroit, tell me about the work he was doing there, and really, introduced me to this idea of community engaged research, this idea around sustainability. And I really appreciate that. And this idea of teaching, you can always learn it no matter what level you're at. So I just want to give a shout out to Jeffrey to being someone who really walks this walk 24/7. And I often think about, him when I'm thinking about this work with community. So it's important to have people that can help you do this walk in academia also.
Yeah, I'll chime in. I have a 30-second response, but that was the perfect kind of segue to what I was going to say. Don't invent the wheel, right? This isn't work that we're trying to develop from scratch. Someone before us has done this work. That is just how research and science goes. You find a model, maybe tailor it to the community that you're working with or the research that you're doing, and you improve in the areas where you think there needs to be improvement or specific to your needs. I think that's the best way to do it for students or for early career professionals, right? Someone has done this before us. That also speaks to the question in the chat. So I work with the New York African Burial Ground, but the original excavation was in the 90s, right? So building on the foundation that they had already established and making it relevant to, instead of osteological analyses, molecular analyses, because the science has just advanced. They had a lot of conversation, I'll keep this brief, about should we excavate, should we not excavate, many different, opinions. And the solution was, well, let's choose stakeholders, right? Or let's hold a town hall. What is the vote? What is the majority? And that is the way that we go, because you have to realize that you can't satisfy everybody and all the opinions of the community.
Thanks so much, everyone. I think we need to move into announcements. I'm sorry we have to end. I wish it was longer. So I think I guess I'll do the announcements. I'm not sure.
I'm happy
go
to
ahead.
jump in here, or if you have
Sure.
anything else you want to offer, Emily.
No, that's all. Thank you to the panelists and audience.
Great. Yeah, thank you all. This was a really, really valuable conversation. Thanks to those who were able to join us today. And I'm glad this was recorded because I think this will be a really helpful resource for students to listen to, even if they weren't able to join the webinar today. So I know we're just about at time, so I wanted to remind you all we have 2 more webinars coming up in the C3HE Spring Webinar Series. So join us on May 28th and June 25th. You can visit our website for more details and to register. And then finally, I just wanted to end with an invitation for you all to please learn more about the Carolinas Collaborative on Climate Health and Equity and the Global One Health Academy, the 2 organizations that were co-hosting this webinar today. So here are our websites. So to learn more about C3HE, visit carolinascap.com. And to learn more about the Global One Health Academy, please visit go.ncsu.edu/GOHA or use the QR code here on the screen. And you can see on our websites research that's been done, opportunities, and upcoming events. So thank you all very much for being here today. Thank you especially to our panelists for all your valuable contributions. And we look forward to seeing everyone next month. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.